Louis Campos est donc, je vais dire son titre officiel, Historian of Science at Royce University Baker College Chair. And it's the first time we have a historian in the laser in Paris, so I'm very honored. So I'll give you the floor.
Very good. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. My talk has a bit of a strange title that you may be wondering about what some of those words mean. So I thought, let me start a little bit more simply here. I want to talk about plants and planets. So let us head west into the ocean to think in some new ways about the terraforming of life here on Earth before we think about how it might apply up above and in extraterrestrial elsewheres. Let us head to Atlantis, an island in the North Atlantic from centuries ago, a place full of remarkable people submerged somewhere beneath the waves in an unexpected disaster. Or more realistically, let us head to the Azores, where in January of 1908, a writer from Harper's Magazine described a low bush growing across the island in narrow stands that the sheep used as protection against the, quote, terrific winter winds. Seen from a distance, he said, similar markings might very readily be produced artificially on Mars. The story was referring to images of Mars that were already widely circulated at the time. And finally, let us go to Ascension, an island in the South Atlantic, more than 1,000 kilometers from anywhere. A place, once upon a time, a barren, windswept rock, that in the decades since Darwin's visit in 1836 has been transformed into a temperate cloud forest, composed of life in no small part brought from elsewhere by humans. The island's flora is half wild and half introduced. 4,000 species of plants that come together in a unique conglomeration. A mongrel biome of perchance and possibility. And also home to a NASA communications and tracking station. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. A little bit of history first. Discovered in 1501 by the Portuguese, who first named it Conception Island, it was rediscovered 2 years later and renamed Ascension Island, after an earlier famous space voyage. This small, remote volcanic island in the South Atlantic was so uninhabitable that it never became home to a Portuguese settlement. And indeed, the first human inhabitant may have been a marooned Dutch seaman convicted of sodomy in 1725, who starved to death on the island. When Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, 1,300 kilometers away, the British Navy then established a small station on Ascension in 1815. A 27-year-old Charles Darwin stopped on by in 1836, commenting on what he saw as its desolate scene, writing, "Imagine smooth conical hills of a bright red color, with their summits generally truncated, rising separately out of a level surface of black, rugged lava. To complete the desolate scene, the black rocks on the coast are lashed by a wild and turbulent sea." By 1843, Darwin's friend and close correspondent, the English botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, was asked by British officers, we're told, whether he saw any way to improve Ascension's habitability. Hooker came up with the idea of importing trees and other plant species to generate a natural freshwater supply and better soil conditions on the island. He decided to try to transform Ascension into a greener, gentler place, we are told, by shipping in trees from around the world and planting them on the jagged brown hills to create an artificial forest, with over 300 trees coming from the gardens at the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, where he would later become the director, and also trees from South America and from Africa. Within 20 years, this place would become known as Green Mountain. And we know that by 1863, sparrows, chaffinches, linnets, and several coastal African birds are said to have arrived on the island. Not everything flourished. There were orchards of oranges, lemons, custard apples, and lychees that were planted in 1868, but only a subset of non-native plants survived. And most of what was called left behind was described as a surviving mashup of flora from Africa and the Americas that ran untended for most of the 1900s. By 1870, 5,000 more trees had been planted, with the idea that these mist-catching trees would change the climate of the island. They would create a pond at the summit, the first freshwater on the island, and that pond today is surrounded by 12-foot-tall bamboo plants. So we have this verdant mishmash on this island, a 19th century experiment that has led to bamboo, aloe, banana bushes, and prickly pears, all side by side. A new combination of species with no historical equivalent that was assembled through human intervention, we're told. And this island might speak to us in new ways today. As National Geographic recently reported, if we indeed want to figure out how to green Mars and settle there, this mountaintop forest surrounded by a volcanic moonscape is our scientific starting point. So this was no Eden, no paradise, but another kind of engineered space, a place where the golf course has greens that are called browns, where the vegetation involves the, quote, long-lasting intimacy of strangers, as Len Margulis once described the phenomenon of symbiosis. On the remote oceanic islands of bare rock, the first forms of life are often lichens, blown in by the wind or dropped by birds, extremophiles that are said to form enduring relationships. And as Merlin Sheldrake has noted, the growth of lichens on freshly exposed rock is a variation on the theme of panspermia, he said. These bare surfaces are inhospitable islands, remote possibilities for most organisms. Barren and seared by intense radiation and exposed to wild storms and temperature fluctuations, they may as well be, he said, other planets. It's interesting to think of how to intertwine ideas of cosmic panspermia and island universes, a term familiar from Kant's study of nebulae, of terrestrial habitability and cosmic elsewheres. Lichens are small biospheres, it said, that include both photosynthetic and non-photosynthetic organisms, thus combining the Earth's main metabolic processes. Lichens are in some sense microplanets, worlds writ small, unquote. Or as another scientist wrote, a lichen moving through space is a neat bundle of life, a whole ecosystem traveling as one. What better organisms to make interplanetary journeys? So what is the right scale when we think about terraformation? An island, a tiny lichen, a plant, a planet? Isaac Newton once said, the Earth resembles a great animal or an inanimate vegetable that draws in its ethereal breath for its daily refreshment and vital ferment and transpires again with gross exhalation. So what is this process of planetary respiration but a biosignature of life elsewhere, evident in the disequilibrium of a planet's atmosphere? Carl Sagan once described the prospect of terraforming with dark plants, or lichens. He talked about some sort of mechanism to devise dark material able to make copies of itself, a little dusky machine, he says, which we deliver to Mars, and then which goes about reproducing itself from indigenous materials all over the polar ice caps. There's a category of such machines, he says, we call them plants. And he goes on and says, what we need is a program of artificial selection and genetic engineering of dark plants, perhaps lichens that could survive the much more severe Martian environment. So he calls this the general idea of terraformation. He proposed the same idea for Venus in 1961 as a way to make a sterile neighbor fit for living forms that may eventually include humans, a promise of remarkable opportunity for man and his descendants, he says, to expand their domains to new extraterrestrial frontiers. And lichens often occurred in these discussions. One Swedish proponent even said that as far as the permanent colonization of Venus is concerned, if we had to synthesize a plant with a maximum of tolerance, it would have to be one that would combine the ability of the desert cactus to economize water and the ability of the Antarctic lichens to withstand cold. And this kind of Arctic cactus would be suitable for the poor ground surface of Mars. There are echoes of these kinds of ideas today. When NASA astrobiologist Beto Kajar says to send in the goo as a form of scientific speculation, maybe we don't have to look for life, we could create it ourselves in these places. And so what if the story of growing life in space is a story of letting it run rampant for a century or more? The story of Ascension Island, but transplanted to another world. I shared Sagan's ideas with my friend, the designer Daisy Ginsburg, a few years ago, and this led to her most recent algorithmic digital intervention called the Wilding of Mars, a garden that is untended, growing on Mars. So what if we unintentionally create new biospheres through our imperfect intentions, or as a side effect? The logic of life escaping human control from confined environments, this is Daisy's project, The logic of life escaping from confined environments is, of course, a story that is told and retold in every generation, from Frankenstein to Jurassic Park. So what if we define ascensions not only as artificially composed biospheres at different scales, but as also including the history of unintentionally artificially composed biospheres? And it's a striking feature that lichens and intention and unintention all come together in discussions of geoengineering and of planetary contamination. These concerns about contamination from extraterrestrial elsewheres, what is now described as planetary protection, is another very fascinating topic from this time, when scientists were wondering how to prevent contamination from Earth to elsewhere or from elsewhere to Earth as they invented new sorts of lunar sterilization protocols and procedures at NASA. And Joshua Letterberg, the man who coined the term of exobiology as well as the term microbiome, made these space-age concerns about extraterrestrial contamination a centerpiece and a priority. And he viewed humans themselves as being full of invasive, contaminatory potential. He says, of the possible payloads for interplanetary travel, living man, of course, excites the widest interest. However, he is a teeming reservoir of microbial contamination, the most difficult to neutralize and an especially apt vehicle for infectious organisms. So this vision of humans as teeming reservoirs was echoed by Lynn Margulis, who I quoted earlier, who asserted that there's never a way to just send just one organism into space, that you're always sending an orgy of organisms. So is terraformation the same thing as contamination? Does it matter on your intentions? Sagan advocated terraformation. Margulis cautioned against contamination. Sagan and Margulis were married for a time, until they weren't. How should we understand unintentional terraforming, the indiscriminate spraying of seeds across the universe? And if panspermia is intentional, what word should we use for these happenstance mixtures? Things that are unintentionally combined and left to run wild for evolutionary time. Perhaps the entire Earth itself, it's been proposed, is an ascension island, the mostly unintentional result of a kind of cosmic garbage. So this unintentional hypothesis, the result of some undirected panspermia, has been an interesting idea that some people have proposed. And thinking about compost and manure and contamination and waste has been a fertile field for investigation of unintentional aftermaths, as well as in systems, closed systems, of trying to provide food for astronauts. One Mars expert even wrote about how the problem of designing organisms to live on Mars is akin to the problems of dealing with sewage. So speaking of cosmic garbage and signals from space, let's return to Ascension Island. One description of the island called it hell with the fire put out. And several parts of the island are described after the devil. One of them is known as the Devil's Ashway. And this was the place selected by NASA for their new tracking station after others had already been establishing stations there. According to NASA, the lack of other activity in this remote part of a remote island meant that there would be maximum protection from noise and from interference from other communications facilities and installations on the island. And they established the manned spaceflight network station there. And we can look at these images from the 1960s as this is getting off the ground, and a painting that was commissioned in 1966 by the architects who had also designed several missile tracking stations for the US government at the time. This tracking station was one of a network of about 17 that existed that ensured that NASA would remain in constant contact with the Apollo missions. So the artificial biosphere of this island, the colonial history of this island and the far reaches of the ocean frontier and the connections of this island and its remote biosphere with the heavens above, I think makes this a particularly resonant place for us to think about when we think about terraformation. We can expand the context of what we usually pay attention to there. And the name of this island in German is perhaps even more resonant, Himmelfahrt, in so trip to heaven island. So it's almost to be predicted then by the 1990s that this artificially composed island and the experiment that took place there, the unintentional experiment, gets described as a venture in terraforming with new insights for surprising ecological relationships that could apply to Mars. So now that we've ascended to the heavens, let me turn briefly then to astrobotany. Being on Mars, or even being on the moon requires food. And dreams of growing crops on the regolith are, of course, centuries old. And the importance of terrestrial agronomy was also at the heart of one of the more interesting and unusual efforts to understand the nature of life in space, which emerged in the context of the work of the Soviet astronomer Gavril Tikhov, who had studied astronomy here in Paris before returning to Russia. And this case raises another interesting question for us again, of what is the right scale for terraformation? Can we reproduce a planetary environment in a small chamber, for instance? So a few years ago, along with the artist and the filmmaker, Ana Maria Gomez Lopez, I went to Almaty, to Kazakhstan, to investigate the origin of this new science of astrobotany in the 1940s. Tikhov, as an astronomer and an expert in the study of light, was interested in comparing the spectroscopic data that he got from light from Mars with plants that grew at high altitude or at high latitude. And this was his effort to try and understand the nature of the light and what plants there might be on Mars here. And part of this effort of studying the quality of the light was to investigate the possibility of the adaptation of food production in Kazakhstan to difficult environments, to extreme climatic conditions, to high temperatures, to a lack of temperature, or a lack of oxygen. So to understand these agricultural dimensions in the Soviet context was essential for him and part of the justification for why he invented this new field based on observation that could claim to understand what the vegetation was like on Mars. Studying life on Mars was not separate from Soviet questions of agronomy. And he talked about efforts to replicate Martian conditions in small, evacuated glass jars, what we might call Mars jars in a later generation. In fact, we do call it that. And if plants could germinate in those sorts of containers or not under Martian diurnal cycles and temperature and moisture context that he thought mimicked what was there. So this was quite difficult, but he proved that, in fact, you could have leaf development happening in the germination of these seeds at elevations that could be up to 25 kilometers high on Earth. So he suggested that life on Mars was, in fact, possible. And a number of interesting experimental problems were here for biology and for biophysics that would help unravel these mysteries of things. So these ideas of using the nature of light and studying the Martian environment and creating these climate-controlled phytotrons we have descendants of in our quest for habitable environments, when we invent life detection experiments on our Martian spacecraft, for instance, or what it might take for an exobiosphere in order for life to survive there. So it turns out Tikhov was having difficulty constructing these chambers himself. And so he was very interested in trying other sorts of ways of connecting these ideas about the possible life on Mars and how we might terraform even Kazakhstan for other things. And we met with one of his students who began to explain some of these scientific and technical aspects that he had been involved in, and how he selected certain species in particular and gathered them into what he called was an astrobotany garden. He put together silver fir and birch trees and other plants to see how plants absorbed and reflected solar radiation. And he even wanted to call the silver spruce in his garden a Martian, because he felt that its colors and its reflective properties would coincide with what existed on Mars. This likely landscape of Mars is what he came up with, where the vegetation would be blue. So his student, Victor Teufel, now an old man in his 80s, shared this story with us about the Astrobotany garden and the work that he had done to try and advocate for new ways of thinking about how we can understand life on Mars and how it's never fully disconnected from the terraformation ideas that we have in mind. We tried to look for the garden. This is the closest we got to it. It turns out this may not be the garden after all. We're still trying to explore and to find out. But there are other gardens that make me think of this story as a possible space. And my university in Houston has opened up a new global center here in Paris at the Hôtel de la Fée in the Marais, a beautiful old building that has a garden at the center of it. And my collaborator and I hope someday to activate the architecture and the horticulture of this garden, and perhaps to make an astrobotanical garden here that will become a place for art-science connections. We think we want to terraform Paris in this way, with this astrobotanical garden, connecting with Tikhov's own studies of astronomy here, and to do so in a way that resonates with this story of Ascension Island, of strange hybridizations, of mongrel possibilities. And what could be more of a mongrel possibility than having a bit of Texas in the heart of Paris? It's also worth noting that the science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson, in his book 2312, envisioned a universe that was full of hollowed-out, terraformed asteroids composed of composite biomes, little seedling biospheres that he called Ascensions. So astrobotanical gardens in Kazakhstan that once sought to bring Mars to Earth are replaced by science fictional visions of ascensions that bring new combinations of earthly life into the asteroid belt. There are new islands in the sky, inverted Atlantises, no longer submerged but raised high above the waves, a story that we might want to think with. Astrobiologists have long asked, what if the life that we know is but one subset of the possible potentialities of life? And as we explore the possibility space of life, might we find other possibilities for life that might exist, but that's not yet been exploited yet? We are always in the process of ascending, I would argue, with test balloons, with rockets, or conceptually with high-flying ideas. Can we ascend beyond our assumptions and our mythologies? Is the course of nature foreordained in a residue of creationist logics, with each organism having a structured place in nature, a niche in an ecology? Or could there be other ways of constructing things, other synthetic possibilities, other contingencies in which niches do not pre-exist but are constructed, other ascensions that are waiting to be undertaken in the mountains of Kazakhstan, on islands in the middle of the ocean, beneath the waves, or in space above our atmosphere?